So today I'm supposed to talk to you about the Pharaoh Cleopatra, which might be an odd thing for a sermon. However, I think she is one of the most miraculous people that I have ever come across in history. Some of you know that I'm an attorney, and actually, I had seen the Elizabeth Taylor extravaganza and, heard stories of the people that she had been with in life. And sadly, she's fallen victim to a lot of the misogynistic propaganda that has belittled women for millennia. She was an incredible person, and how I came across her was, actually, I'm a real estate attorney, and it was a real estate transaction. And the real estate transaction was when she was with Mark Antony, she was given the land of Judea. And that land was full of balsam trees, and it was the source of national pride to the people that lived there. And the king at that time was Herod. And she realized that if she was going to keep that territory, she would probably have to send in an occupying army to keep that territory. But she came up with a different solution, which is essentially what we look at as a modern leaseback. I know I get all excited as a real estate attorney, you really don't care. But I found it amazing. Basically, what she said to him in her creative negotiating was, look, this land is so valuable to you. Not only do you make a lot of money from it, but it's also a source of national pride. So I tell you what I'll do. Rather than leaving an occupying army here, which I will have to pay for in order to keep my soldiers here, I'll lease it back to you. And when I lease it back to you, I will take out all my soldiers. And the only thing you will have to do is pay me a leasing fee. And for that leasing fee, I will leave you alone and let you do whatever you want with this land, because I know that it's very profitable to you. And it will be a win-win for both of us. Now, I was just blown away by that negotiation. How creative, how wonderful a solution to something that could have turned out very differently. Let's think of maybe Iraq and how we still have occupying forces there. I wish she worked for the State Department, and maybe she could come up with a way to get us out. But I wanted to give you a little bit of history, and I won't be a history teacher, but I think giving context to her life is really important to understand why she is so important to me, and hopefully you will take some of the things I learned from her and maybe help apply them to your life. And particularly in this week, I thought a lot about her and wondered what she might consider doing in these situations. She was, of course, Pharaoh of Egypt. She was a scholar, a political strategist, a military strategist, a naval commander, a diplomat, a mathematician, a philosopher, an orator, an astronomer, a linguist. From everything we know, she spoke between 9 and 12 languages. Mother of 4, and wife. Now, that's a pretty impressive resume. Now, many people think that she was Egyptian. She was actually Greek. And there's been a lot of debate about that, but the truth of the matter is, she is a direct descendant of Ptolemy Soter I, who was one of Alexander the Great's generals. And what happened is, when Alexander died, his generals decided to break his kingdom up into 3 parts, and Ptolemy took the part that included Egypt. And the Ptolemies ruled Egypt as the final dynasty of Egypt for 300 years. They had some interesting customs. They preferred to marry either a sibling or a close cousin, which, we absolutely do not do today, but this is just how they lived. But they were also very interesting. Even though they ruled Egypt, they refused to learn the Greek language. They actually rejected the very people that they were ruling. She was the first of the Ptolemies in 300 years to not only learn the Egyptian language, but embrace the culture. At 14, she was named co-regent with her father, Ptolemy the 12th. He was not the best ruler. And 4 years later, when he died at 18, she was named co-ruler with her then 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. Because her father was not the best ruler, she was left to govern a country in famine, political struggles, and a failing economy. Is anybody familiar with that kind of a situation? Now imagine having to deal with it at age 18. There was also constant family upheaval. If anyone here are Game of Thrones fans, you know, like brother killing brother, sister killing sister, cousin killing, very normal in this family. To say they were dysfunctional, probably a good definition. So she really had to deal with all of these things at the age of 18. By the third year of her joint reign with her brother and his advisors felt that she was taking over too much of the country. So essentially, they plotted to get rid of her. She found out about this, and she was forced to flee Egypt and going into the desert and trying to figure out what she was going to do. Now, at this point, she's 21 years old. I don't know what you were doing at 21, but I'm sure you weren't trying to figure out how on earth to get your kingdom back. At that time, Julius Caesar actually seized the capital of Egypt from her 13-year-old brother. And in the now famous story, before her brother could begin negotiations with Caesar, she had herself smuggled in to see Caesar rolled in a carpet. Now, I find that absolutely fascinating. So at age 21, she became the mistress of Julius Caesar, who was then 52. A year later, their son Caesarion was born. During a later battle, her brother Ptolemy XIII was drowned in the Nile. And then according to Egyptian law, she was required to marry another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. So here she is, she's 22, she's got a baby, she's now married twice to two of her brothers, but it's interesting, she never produced any children from any of those marriages. I know it's kind of salacious, isn't it? In 46 BC, Cleopatra, her brother, and her son go to visit Caesar in Rome. This, of course, was considered scandalous, since he was already married. Not only that, it really upset the Romans because not only did Caesar have her living in one of his country houses, but he actually erected a golden statue of her in the image of Isis and placed it in the temple of Venus. Now, as you know, the Romans were very committed to their gods, and this really upset them. But it's interesting about their relationship. From everything that I've read, their relationship was really one of intellectual equals. He marveled at her ability to discuss any matter of the times. Of course, Cleopatra, Ptolemy, and Caesarion were in Rome when Caesar was murdered on March 14th, 44 BC. We all know that date, the Ides of March. They returned to Egypt, and soon after that, her brother died, so her son was named co-ruler. After that, Mark Antony, the civil war erupted in Rome. And of course, she backed Caesar's friends, Mark Antony and Octavian, providing them with troops and funds. Later on in 41 BC, Mark Antony asked her for support in another military campaign. He was so taken with her that he actually spent several months with her in Alexandria, and on December 25th, 40 BC, their twins, Alexandria Helios and Cleopatra Selene, were born. He then visited Cleopatra 4 years later after that campaign and married her, and that produced another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Of course, Mark Antony did a really bad thing in Roman eyes. He actually divorced his Roman wife, making his marriage with Cleopatra legitimate. In addition, he recognized both Caesar's children and his own, which essentially kind of ticked off a world war at that time, because they were concerned that Cleopatra was building an empire that would rival that of Alexander's, and Rome would fall to that empire. And so she continued her relationship with Mark Antony, but of course, since Rome was so upset by this, they gave Octavian permission to actually invade Egypt. And of course, we know the famous Battle of Actium. Soon after that battle, both Cleopatra and Antony lay dead. But what I really want to focus on is the 25 years between age 14 and age 39. Now, I recently turned 50, and when I kind of went through all the things she did by the time she was 39, I got tired. So I really started looking at her and looking at some of the qualities that she had in her life that produced a legacy that we still talk about today. The first one was that she was an incredibly creative human being. She was a true creative. When she made the decision to actually allow herself to be essentially treated like baggage and rolled up in a carpet and presented as a gift to Caesar, that's brilliant. Name another king or queen that you've ever heard do something like that. I love her because she was a dreamer. Typically, when you're faced with an empire crumbling, you shrink back. You think, well, I can just live out my years quietly. I'll use the last of the money in the treasury, and, I will just go off quietly into the night. She did the exact opposite. She had big dreams for herself. She dared to imagine a world that was different than the one she lived in. Her goal, of course, was world domination. Some of us might have the same goal, but she was incredibly clever about how she went about it. Another thing that I marvel at is her confidence. She believed in and put faith in the resources of her mind and her imagination. Often when we're faced with a problem, we think, oh my God, what am I going to do? But she really relied on herself and her internal resources to get through all of the situations that she had to deal with in life. She was an incredibly creative marketer. Remember that the Ptolemies essentially rejected Egyptian culture. She completely shifted a 300-year-old paradigm to gain popular support from the people of Egypt by naming herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis. So not only did she speak their language and embrace their culture, she actually fully embraced their religion and essentially set herself up as part of it, which would prove well in the future, because even if you go to Egypt today, Cleopatra is talked about widely. The other thing is she was an incredibly resourceful human being. She was able to effectively and imaginatively work out situations, especially when they were difficult. She harnessed her intellect, her strength, her knowledge, her personality, her royal position, her social connections, her country's wealth, its geographic location, to work to her advantage. She knew she had these things at her disposal, and she used them. Often when we encounter difficult situations, we are kind of looking over the hill. Well, the grass is greener on the other side. Let me look over there. What she did is she said, well, what do I have at my disposal? And she used those things to the maximum. As I said, I thought she was also an incredibly creative negotiator, because at the end of that negotiation with Herod, it was a win-win for both of them. He got to keep his country, he got to keep his source of national pride, she got to get a land lease, and she didn't have to leave an occupying force. I really, really think that we need some people like her at the State Department now. The other thing that I find amazing about her is that she was an incredibly resilient human being. And one of the reasons I think she was so resilient is because she was completely proactive. She took matters into her own hands. She took responsibility for herself and for her circumstances, despite who created them or how they were created. She was left with a country on the brink of collapse. She could have sat back and said, well, this is what my father did, and this is what I have to deal with. It didn't seem for a moment that she ever shrank from dealing with the monumental tasks that she was faced with. Instead, she kind of, I guess you would say, she barreled ahead. She was bad, and she was bold. Her circumstances were never perfect, But as opportunities presented themselves, she took advantage of everyone. And there were some she actually created for herself, as in the carpet situation. The other thing I admire about her is that she was brave. She was courageous. She stood up to some of the most powerful men in Egypt and Rome at the time. And remember, she didn't have like a, committee behind her or a party behind her. A lot of these things she did alone because she couldn't even trust her own brothers and sisters to support her. So she bravely stood up. She was also an incredible risk taker. And I need some of that. I think sometimes we all do. In her difficulties, she was willing to take any number of risks. Remember, she was deposed and kicked out of Egypt. It would have been easy for her to send an emissary to Caesar or to find some other way around it. She took the risk herself. She put herself in jeopardy in order to reach her goal. Again, she went against 300 years of tradition. To give you a barometer of what that looks like, the United States this year will be 240 years old. Add 60 to that, and that's the traditions that she went against. Of course, many of those traditions created by men, and often she had to battle men, including her brother and all of his advisors, to get to her goal. The final thing, which many people don't see, but I really believe this about her, is that I think she had a lot of humility. She wasn't bound by pride or arrogance. She was willing to do what was necessary to get to her goal. If you think about it, when she's rolled up in the carpet and she's treated like baggage, does she do the opposite in terms of saying, well, I really should go in there with a huge retinue and dancing girls and announce myself. After all, I am a queen and I really should have this for myself. No, she did the exact opposite. She allowed herself to be treated as baggage. She gave up her pride, she gave up her arrogance, and she got to her goal. And I think that's a big lesson for all of us to learn, because sometimes we need to be the first one to apologize, or we need to be the first one to really humble ourselves and say, my pride and my arrogance will not get me to my goal. I really, really need to think about the best way to move forward. And so by the time she was 39, she had survived multiple attempts on her life. She was overthrown by her younger brother. She lived in constant threat of assassination. She was constantly going up against the norms of a society where a woman was essentially supposed to stay at home and say nothing. And she did the exact opposite of those things. So this is why she is absolutely one of my greatest heroes in life, because she was bad, she was bold, she was wise, she was hard, she was tough, she was cool, she was calm, and she kept it together for the love of her kingdom and the love of her children. Thank you.